Welcome to Pure Signal, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what matters in tech. I'm Vincent Yates, the Global Chief Data Scientist here at Credera, and I'm your data guy. I was the Chief Data Scientist at GE, led data science at Uber, at Microsoft, and at Zillow. Joining me, as always, is Jason Goth, our fellow Global CTO, former American Airlines Chief Architect. Is that right?
Yes.
You also saved the government with a bit of a snafu they had rebuilding some platform for them.
That's correct.
And you've done a fair amount of consulting in your life. 60 of the Fortune 100 you've actually worked with, or collectively we've worked with here. Pretty amazing. Thank you, Jason, for joining us today.
Good to be back.
And
save the government. We should hear about that story, maybe.
We should talk about the story someday. But Jason always cuts me off whenever I try. So Kevin, thank you for joining me, our North America CEO here, our chief grower.
Chief grower.
Chief grower. If you didn't plant, that's why there's so many plants in the background. You grow all these personally, right? Green thumb. No, you really have led a bunch of organizations from education to, of course, Fortune 100 companies, really helping them understand what's that strategic vision of how do you grow this company? How do you get to something significant and have a huge impact? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So for those who are repeat customers, if you will, repeat listeners, as it were, we used to call this technology tangents. As we said in the last episode, we're rebranding to Pure Signal. So that's what we're going to do from henceforth is Pure Signal. Today, I want to jump right in, though. We have about 4 topics that I want to talk about. Every layer of the enterprise stack is fundamentally under pressure. There's the financial rails that are consolidating in terms of the traditional finance and the decentralized finance. Policy changes are happening at a dizzying pace, a whirlwind of change there. The AI platforms are, again, relentlessly pursuing their growth and evolution, and you're starting to see some differentiation in the strategy of those companies that I want to talk about today. And then finally, the actual infrastructure to power all of this is no doubt straining. So we're going to break those 4 seismic shifts down and talk a bit about how they impact businesses and companies, enterprises writ large. Sound like a plan?
Let's go.
Okay. So to kick us off, I want to talk about crypto, Web3, and the M&A, really from this hype to infrastructure that we're seeing. For those who don't know, in the past, just this year, past 4 months, 88 deals totaling $8.2 billion worth of mergers and acquisitions that have been taking place this year. You have the crypto deal making across the entire the U.S. This is, by the way, is a triple in the U.S. of what we had seen in the previous year in 2024. So the rate of change is seismic, and it doesn't seem to be just driven by hype. I mean, in fact, if you go to, we talked about CES, we didn't see much of anything at crypto, nothing in 24, very little this year. You're not hearing about it on the news in the typical hype cycle way. So there seems to be something else just beneath the surface here. It seems that a lot of traditional finance firms, so, you know, the likes of 21 Capital, DCCC, Ripple, even sort of a more modern version of it, are doing a lot of activities. And I kind of broke it down into, call it 4 or 5 categories of M&A activity. So you have the Bitcoin treasury acquisitions. This is like MicroStrategy, right? So there's a company, MicroStrategy is a company that effectively does nothing, but buy a lot of Bitcoin. All of their treasury capital is in Bitcoin. And so it was a really fascinating move back before any of this has any regulations that allowed the average investor, retail investor, to buy in large stake Bitcoin, blockchain. They can just buy it from MicroStrategy, which is a publicly traded company. They happen to own all of these assets, and that's almost their entire enterprise value. And then you effectively get that thing. What you're seeing is more companies doing that. 21 Capital specifically is doing that. The second trend you see is the sort of traditional finance companies merging with the DeFi companies. So this is like DTCC acquiring Security, for example. And then you have the institutional service acquisition. So this would be like Ripple. They bought several companies. Actually, I didn't even know these companies originally. Medico and Hidden Road, both of those companies have been purchased now by them just in this first quarter of this year. You have the actual exchanges themselves being consolidated. So Kraken specifically ended up buying NinjaTrader. That was quite a big acquisition. And then you have the on-chain mergers. And so this is where the companies on paper and sort of the legal entities may not do a lot, but on the chain themselves, they're mixing the assets together. This is like Fetch AI, Ocean Protocol, Singularity, .NET, effectively becoming one single currency, kind of consolidating the user base effectively and giving it more liquidity. And so I think this aligns largely with what we talked about earlier this year in terms of predictions and really what VCs have been talking about and hoping for, I think, for some time, which is a rise of consolidation in these plays, in part because there's hopes at least for clear regulation. So David Sachs being the AI and sort of blockchain and Web3 crypto czar, specifically, I think that's how AI and crypto czar, I think is his title specifically. He's made a lot of progress pushing these departments to let stuff and classify stuff appropriately. You see, I think that these people like Stripe, for example, buying Bridge, it seems to be companies that were a little on the cutting edge, but were skeptical are now taking a risk. And it's not the regulation clarity. There's not that at all. But they're doing it anyway, I think, in the hopes of that strategic positioning. So turning it over to you, Jason, just from a technology standpoint, I mean, we have the return of the Web 2 buyers. I think, like I said, on the promise of Web 3 being regulated in a way that's actually usable. What are some of the technical challenges of actually integrating the traditional financer into a sort of distributed finance company?
Well, backing up just before I answer that question, I think the main thing to me about all the merger and acquisition is, I think it is a much ado about nothing. I think it is largely driven by some of the clarity and regulation. So you've got the Genius Act, the Stable Act, right? They're being drafted. But it really, if you go read them, they don't do much but provide definitions, right, around what is a stable coin and what are the requirements to, be an authorized issuer, right? Essentially, you have to be audited. You have to keep a certain amount of, it's really interesting that the governing body in all the proposed legislation is the FDIC, although they will not be, some of these stable coins will not be FDIC insured. It is still the governing body. And I think essentially by defining, all of these terms and defining what regulations there will be and what, each type of entity or each type of coin would be subject to, it's just provided some clarity so that, I think that's probably 2 years worth of M&A demand that's been pent up waiting for the clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that's what you get. I haven't seen in any of our clients, financial services clients, any big shift in like strategy around merging DeFi and traditional finance. Right. I think it's all just a response to, having the rules defined. So that would be my first comment in terms of, okay, well, what does it take to merge them? And I think that's what a lot of some of these mergers are, right? Most financial services firms, they now have ways to, APIs or they've acquired things where they can do on, chain purchases. So you get Fidelity, you now see you can buy Bitcoin or whatever in your traditional account, and they're essentially plumbing to that. I think that's what some of these are. And so I think it's for those type of use cases, right, where it's not a merge, it's more of a bolt-on, right? You can buy A or you can buy B, right? The integrations are fairly simple and largely done or in progress with some of these. Your question about is there some type of merger, or is that idea around like, hey, can we use something like these stablecoin rails to do kind of cross, border instant settlement, not have to go through SWIFT, those kind of things. That's been highly, a use case that has been highly, hyped. Maybe it will, I don't see it. I don't know that there's a significant value. I mean, other than speed, right? The speed of the settlement and maybe some of the fees, although it's yet to be done and shown that it'd be that much cheaper, with all of the crypto processing fees. So, I don't know. I don't see any big companies going after this all of this shift in strategy to go around all of these use cases. I think this is just pent up demand. So that did not answer your question about the
Well, it sort
The
of is,
challenges in integrating. I mean, I think there are a lot of challenges in integrating, but again, I don't see a lot of people even doing that.
So it seems like you're saying that most of this M&A activity, $8 billion, that's a big number, right? Big number here. Most of that is due to regulatory, or at least the promise of regulatory clarity. It's a very offensive strategic move, broadly speaking. And from a technological standpoint, it sounds like you're saying it's mostly almost an acqui-hire. That is, they're trying to position themselves rather than rebuild it from the ground up, hire these people, just buy a company who already has done that. And
Or
been working
buy
on it.
adjacent services.
Right. And effectively that would then imply, or I guess my follow-up question, that is there actually some underlying technological shift? I mean, you and I have talked about blockchain and Web3 for years now. We've always been a bit negative, frankly, pessimistic about the reality of the hype that
You
we're
listen
hearing.
to the 6-part technology tangent series.
If
where
5
we-
wasn't enough to convince you of my
Yeah.
position, I added a 6th one.
Exactly.
That's right.
Do you think something is fundamentally changed, or is this really just a strategic, opportunistic move to position themselves as a leading edge company in this space?
Nothing's fundamentally changed. I mean, that's the key. And in fact, that's, I think, one of the problems when you look at the founder of Ethereum. They're like, this thing has grown. It's become too complicated to work with, and the APIs are difficult, and you kind of have to have a lot of technical understanding. We can't actually, people can't actually use it and become proficient in it and integrate it with things. We got to think through it. I mean, that's been, I think, the problem is the lack of innovation. I mean, people think about it as like a super innovative space, but like the underlying technology isn't innovating. It's just people are using it for, because people go make 50 new crazy coins, right? Does not mean there's an innovation in the technology stack, right?
There's
It's
a new innovation on how you collect money if you're a sitting president.
Yeah,
perhaps.
exactly.
There's anyway, it's a side comment, but I
but
do
no,
think
it's I don't see any fundamental shifts in the technology. Again, back to the 6-part rant, right? One of the things we said it's a solution looking for a problem. And so far, no one's come up with a good problem for it to solve. And so, is, cross-border kind of SWIFT-like settlement is some of this layer 2 stuff where it could actually be used by end consumers? One, potentially, but there's not that many innovations. I mean, out in the real world, iterating, right, with actually meeting customer demand and iterating on those services like there are with other technologies. Take AI for example, right? Like they have, like, whether it be DeepSeek or the reasoning models. I mean, they're true innovation, new platforms that are driving new capabilities that are being used and iterated on. I just don't see that in crypto and Web3.
that's fair. So over to you, Kevin. I'm going to ask you roughly the same question. We've seen this return of Web2 buyers who I think were scared off because of the FTX problem with the NFT problem, all of these meme coins that went to the moon and then zero and sort of bankrupt a bunch of people. Do you think that people are just buying the crypto expertise in technology rather than building it internally? Is it just an M&A play from that side, like an acqui-hire play? Or is this really this consolidation we're seeing, is it really a strategic bet and a lasting institutional confidence in blockchain and Web3?
I'd go somewhere likely in the middle. I think, and knowing that there's probably people and companies that are on either side of that, that bell-shaped curve. But a couple things as we were talking about this, it's intriguing to me, random musings, if you will. One is, as you just mentioned, you had really the bubble burst, significantly, 24 months ago, whatever it was, so there was clearly some buying opportunity, for that, just simply in terms of both, like you said, in terms of talent, but also just simply distressed assets. And so, my first lens is coming back, like what is actually an indictment of the potential of this market versus there's a lot of dry powder that needs to go someplace. And so I think there's one of it could just be simply that, right? And again, I don't know who's doing all the buying, what is, firm to firm, what is, equity backed. it's an area that if you look at all the uncertainty of the world, it actually might be an area that, hey, because this doesn't have as much ties to geopolitical and some of those other components like that, then it might be an area just underserved assets. So I think there's probably some of that in my mind. Some of it is just simply buying things up on the cheap. It's an interesting play, whether or not there's a talent game here, whether it be in this actual technology itself or just simply creative technical minds that can be applied to different elements in a way that needs to be used to greater things. If I go back to the geopolitical side, which I'm prone to do, I just wonder if it's an area of all this uncertainty between treasury and debt and China and tariffs and all these different elements like this. Well, this is an ecosystem that plays a little bit outside of that. And, it could be that, hey, regulation is coming, which makes it more attractive, or it could be that it's not quite there, so it makes it a bit more attractive because they feel like they can continue to play in it.
The uncertainty is almost a hedge then in that
Yeah.
context. That's interesting.
Yeah. So then then it goes back into kind of how do you think about this? It is intriguing to see how it's come back, and obviously the humorous side of just political figures and what they're doing with it and how that plays into it. That just that feeds the seventh part episode on how it's not really real. But I think it is intriguing that there has been such flow to it. Then I think the broader question: do we think that what happened a few years ago with the big burst was that good or bad? Well, I think it reflected to how quickly it ramped up. I think the fundamental belief that there is going to be additional currency and different ways that work through that. I think that was a need that was trying to serve. Just the way it kind of the spectacular way that it grew and crashed. Well, that still doesn't change that need. So you could be seeing that. So then it comes back. Well, what do you do about that? I think that it is intriguing to your point around some, more maybe not bleeding edge, but early stage financial income, firms are starting to play more into that. I think as that continues to happen, as the individual investors are able to buy and sell within this, is it closer to buying T-bills and stocks, or is it closer to going to Vegas and the craps table? Maybe today it's a little bit more closer to actually buying and trading real assets versus where it was 36 months ago. But I still think it's probably an area that's going to continue to grow and materialize. And I think that companies, depending on what you do, particularly if you're in global elements of trade, I think probably having some ability to play and have this be part of your overall strategy of how you collect payment or give payment, or as a treasury, as a part of your overall just portfolio theory of how you look at assets. I think it's probably an interesting area that is probably mainstream enough that it's probably wise for people to be thinking about it. Now, is it top 10 on CEO agendas? Probably not. Unless you really think that you're going to see government default and you need to have some sort of hedge. But there's probably a lot of other things in making sure that you have capacity. But it is an interesting play, just purely looking at it from a technical capacity and skill sets, a place to buy folks that maybe need a place to get a paycheck.
The last question for you then, Kevin, is if you are a CEO or a CFO, how should you think about that treasury allocation? Is it worth it? Like, what's that framework? I mean, you alluded to it, but how do you think about that? Like, how would you prioritize this versus doing a traditional T-bill or something else?
Yeah, I think it depends on the nature of your business, not to kind of punt on it, but again, it depends on what you're buying and selling in. A financial services firm, more important for you to be aware of it. If you're Cargill, well, maybe not, or maybe you would, because it's easier for you to buy grain out of certain countries. I think it's got to be probably dependent on what your business is and what that looks like. Where it plays into that. I would think it should be somewhere on your scenario planning. I think that just like having tariffs and other things that come into your environment, that are going to continue to impact what happens if tensions continue to rise between the U.S. and China, and all of a sudden that treasury market isn't available. I'd probably put that into that category unless you are a firm that specializes it. Now, in a financial trading firm, what's interesting to me is someone who dabbled at times within iBanking. There is a bit of element of this, like how much of it is a made-up market, how much is a made-up thing, and so it becomes real because there's enough people playing in it. But when it comes back to building the fundamentals of why society exists, where does this fit into that? But that's part of where society is today. We have a lot of elements of our economy that in and out without themselves really don't necessarily play. But I think the other thing too, and My suspicion is, and this is an area that's outside of my domain, but there is probably enough nefarious actors that require this to be able to be a mechanism of trade, that it exists within that environment. And so because of that alone, is going to require governments and companies to be able to play in it. It probably will continue to push mainstream like we've seen in other areas that get fueled through those type of means.
That's funny you say that. That was exactly my answer, which is like, in my mind, look, you could be a MicroStrategy and you take a huge bet on it. That's fine. I mean, Elon did actually a fairly similar bet with Tesla a while back. I think most of his holdings have been sold at this point, but still fascinating, just speculative bet. Like, how do we invest our capital? We think we can get a higher ROIC on Bitcoin than we can in our own company. Fascinating, interesting. But I think that the way I'd probably play it is I'd effectively buy it as a hedge, to your point, but also an insurance policy, which is in a post-breach world, at some point, some system you have will probably be compromised. And having a little bit of cash, or Bitcoin in this case, on the side that is the sort of de facto currency isn't a terrible strategy. And if you get the upside of that at the same time, it seems to me it's worth it.
Yeah.
But that's my perspective. Overall, though, I think it is really a strategic driver seems to just be building bridges between traditional finance and then DeFi world. And the M&A activity could be laying the groundwork in the central infrastructure for widespread institutional adoption. But at this stage, it's probably fairly speculative from my standpoint. Nevertheless, the regulation, to your point, is fascinatingly complex and makes strategy in the space really complicated. Speaking of complex and regulatory, let's turn to the minefield that is the policy making so far this year. We've seen a lot of changes from a tariff standpoint, taxes, $4 trillion kind of guessing game as to what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. We've seen, 125% tariff on China imports, for example. We saw a huge acceleration of imports in the first quarter. We've seen a massive tank now as we hit Q2, these tariffs actually come in. So that had some really interesting and sort of difficult to understand implications on the GDP growth broadly in Q1. And I think it took a minute for investors to process that, because you saw after this announcement, you saw a huge drop in the stock market. And over the weekend, people processed what's really going on here. And it went right back to where it was. But either way, it's about a $4.5 trillion change in the market in terms of tax cuts and credits. And I can imagine that for many of our leaders, they're struggling to figure out, how do I plan this world? And so I want to talk a bit about that. If you think about it from an industrial side in particular, we have the Jobs Act that's changing here. We have that expiring effectively this year, 2025. That'll change a lot in capital and infrastructure bets, right? So the bonus depreciation now has already been phased out to 60% at this point. It'll be phased out to 0. R&D expensing will change, the QBI deductions, and even SALT caps will be phased out this year. Again, SALT less so for corporate, but for individuals, all of that might change your labor strategy of where do you actually locate your offices. Of course, the tariffs, between 2 and 20+%, depending on what country you're importing from. How do you reallocate your supply chain and reshore, change the shore? Onshore, what do you do there? I think that's a really difficult thing. And I think the hardest part about both of these huge changes is those are big capital investments. Those aren't things that take a month or 2 months or 2 weeks to change. They take years typically. And so I want to talk a little bit about just how that rapid escalation, that rollback, how companies really think through this. And I think that this interplay between the domestic policy and the global competitiveness is significant. And I think the implications, whether it be tax policies, bonus depreciation, for example, whether it be tariffs, for example, or how companies actually expense R&D investments, really changes the games of how do CEOs and executives allocate the resources. So Kevin, to you, how should businesses balance the risk of waiting to see what's going to happen with these policy changes versus the cost of inaction effectively, especially when some of these investments are multi-year?
That is the interesting question right now, right? Between what do you try to do? How do you try to interpret whether your competitors, your customers, and now again, government versus standing pat, doing what you think. So, I'm going to go back to, again, some themes that we've discussed before. I almost think there's so much uncertainty what's going on that the only thing that you're clearly have certainty on is that it's going to change. It's going to continue to consistently change. And so you come back and so I think that would that potentially make you be more cautious on multi-year long-term investments? I think so. But I also think that the cost of doing nothing for most companies is actually also very significant, particularly when we look at AI and some of the other investments that are require attention. And so, I think executive teams have to be aware of the risk, but I think it's probably, for me, more noise than it is, than not. I mean, I think there has to be at some point a rational actor, and to me, not an individual politician per se, but a rational actor is that groups of people want to get elected, and so that means that you can't radically change things. The time horizons are too short, and so I would think that as a government team, I'd be going for the kind of hitting for the fairway. What do we think is going to be happen? What's going to look like consistent opportunities? How do we continue to be wise in the choices that we make? Things coming back more domestic is likely to be occur. I tend to be more hopeful that we'll be able to have a North America policy versus pitting three countries against each other. But I do think that things are going to continue to evolve. So I would be trying to focus in on what you can, which is how do you make sure that you're offering competing and competitive products and services to your customers? How do you making sure that you're shoring up areas of growth, which this is where I think some areas that may be a bit, it may be a moment where you actually do make some kind of like just foundational improvements. There is a point in time as a homeowner, you have to replace the air conditioner and you have to replace the roof. And well, if I don't know exactly what's going to happen, maybe now is the time to make some of those changes, which I think would be, from a technical perspective, how do you change your team, your skills, your expectations? So, I'm going to generally still remain optimistic, because if you just are living day to day what's happening in Washington, or is Buffett going to retire? Is he not going to retire? Or, is someone going to invade someone or not? I mean, you can't worry about some of that stuff. And I think that at the end of the day, rational actors are, how much did the whipsaw that's occurred with tariffs in the last 40 days, 45 days, how much of that was planned? How much of that was a reaction? How much is that a fundamental belief that I'm willing to wreck the economy in order to prove my point? I mean, who knows? I mean that assumes that Washington actually knows. And so I think the steady course is actually to remain on your fundamentals and work through that and make calculated investments. I think what's more interesting or harder potentially, and I'm biased a bit towards my role and maybe even our company, is like, how do you anticipate growth? What is, kind of staying status quo, which for many companies, ours included, status quo feels like you're failing, and how do you continue to make wise choices in that? Watching the two of you sell services for the last decade, and really even going further back out to that decade, the struggle that we were having to get our clients to understand the need for these infrastructure investments in terms of data, plumbing, pipeline, security, all those things. And it was really difficult, and it was difficult to get people, why should they do that? Those are tomorrow guys' problems. And I think now we're in a scenario where it is so clear that those things, having them work, are going to be what's going to be the currency that fuels any innovation and advancements that you get through AI technologies. So again, I may not know what I'm going to do. I may not know what the government's going to do. I may not know what that's going to change there. I do know, though, for me to do anything to be able to take advantage of that, or to capitalize on that, or to survive those changes, I can make these investments now. And I think that it's probably similar. Again, I tend to go back and, Jason, this is more your field of study than mine, but when I look at when we have major technical advancements, mainframe to PC, to, on-prem to cloud, to mobile, all these different elements, there's a lag in really building out the infrastructure that requires for that, both from a technology, but from a people and a process perspective. So right now, in a moment of uncertainty, I don't think companies, some will go under and they'll have to struggle, but for most are going to have to adapt. It may be that that's where you get security, is that you make these investments that have been there, you're working through that. And so, I think that going back to a company and going back where I'd make investments, I'd be making investments in tech talent and to make sure that your infrastructure is in place, speed, agility, and then kind of, not be sitting idly by, but also know that at the end of the day, how you serve your customers and your employees is going to dictate success more than what happens in things we don't control.
Just to give an example of that, when I worked at the airlines long ago, there was always this thought around, like, we need to be able to get data off the mainframe, good data, quality, off the mainframe, and get it, quickly, in near real time, and not have some of the, mainframe data problems. Well, that's too hard, right? That's too hard, and we don't really need to, like, why we're not using, we don't have any other systems that are not on the mainframe, and do we really want to invest in that? And then, a few years go by, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we have these machine learning capabilities to improve forecasting and scheduling, and we have this third party tool now that's available, for the SaaS tool that's available to do this. Like, we, really need to be able to, it's like, well, now you're in a spot like people are able to adopt that. That's famously Delta had built this, what they call the Delta digital nervous system back in the day, which, moved data around, and they were able to adopt things really quickly. Other airlines struggled with that. And it's like, well, wouldn't it be nice, if we had that before we needed, the old joke about when's the best time to plant a tree, right?
Yeah, 20 years ago.
Or if you can't go back and do it 20 years ago, the best time is today.
And that makes sense. I think the policy whiplash should be background noise for companies, to your point. And it is, I think, for those who are actually agile and ready to adapt. But for those who aren't, who have ossified technologically, culturally, process, etc., it certainly is not background noise. And I think it becomes a critical strategic challenge for those companies. And it demands board level attention, frankly. If your company cannot innovate, cannot move quickly and adapt, then you're going to be left far behind because things are changing really quickly. So how resilient is your supply chain? If you wanted to do a scenario planning of a port getting shut down or a country being shut down, could you do it? How flexible is your financial modeling? Could you simulate? Could you run a forecast? What would happen under different policy changes? I think the agility, the rigorous scenario planning, whether it be geographic, diversification, or whether it be effectively just what's happening from a policy standpoint, are going to be critical issues that will end up differentiating the winners and losers in this current wave of companies. I'd say, to your point, you have to invest in technology, you have to invest in the people, get great talent, and also you have to invest in AI. Everybody has a new tool in their toolbox that can really help them with, turns out, exactly these things. And that actually leads to the next segment that I want to talk about.
Well, maybe one step before, and then this is not, sorry for interrupting your flow, but I think is interesting.
How to transition, Kevin. Come on.
I know.
It's okay. What is it?
The transition. But one thing that this goes back to, I was reading recently, just again, talking about who's going to win with all this stuff. And, one of the arguments who's going to win is lobbyists. Which just makes me mad, and again, but it goes back to, again, fundamentally, like, I'm sure there's some type of exchange traded fund that looks at what's the percentage of R&D investment versus percentage of lobbyists, K Street lobbyists, and I think that there's a element of that too, where I'm going to appeal to all our listeners to, like, focus on building things and businesses. And if you're requiring and relying on lobbying to be able to protect your interests, I mean, you want to be wise. I think this is part of the problem. I think we're seeing some of this in Europe right now. I think that, so much of the governments and businesses are so much more intertwined that you're seeing that so much of the fortunes of business, and ultimately how that impacts the average citizens of your country, is dependent on what goes on in the government sector. And I think that, I just think that we got to be careful on that. I think that, we're in another moment of, like, where, that's probably the thing that's most concerning. A lot of things are concerning about the tariffs, but essentially the idea that we're going to really force everyone to renegotiate their own special deals, like that, just all that does is create friction. But I think, that's an interesting element too of how we, I don't know where we're going, and how, going back, I would implore, the more you focus on what you control and less on those elements, the better you're going to be in the long run. Which now can lead to your wonderful transition.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think that this is the next thing we're seeing is a rapid progression in AI. No doubt. We've been talking about it on this pod forever. It's all we talk about.
Blockchain?
Yeah. AI is all we talk about.
And
That's
phishing.
right. And there's actually been a really interesting and key development over the past couple of weeks now, effectively. It's really been in the making for many months, but it really became clear, I think, in the past few weeks. And that's a divergence in strategy between two of the best players in the market right now. So OpenAI versus Google. OpenAI, of course, has great brand recognition. They're synonymous effectively with chatbots. If you think chatbot, you think ChatGPT, of course. And they're going all in on a sort of standalone platform. They're going to integrate everything into their little agent, into their website, into their tool, your desktop tool. Everything will just live there. They just released new features now that allow you to do e-commerce. So they have a carousel that shows you the products they're talking about when you ask for reviews of, we talked about this before, what boat batteries should I buy? Well, now it just shows up right there. Here's a carousel with all the different batteries, table, all of that there. Versus Google, who just released 2.5, and actually 2.5 beats OpenAI on many of these metrics. Again, a lot of those tests are now being gamed effectively, but nevertheless, beats them. They took a very different approach. They're going breadth versus depth in that sense. They're integrating into all of their existing tools, from search to Gmail to workspaces, YouTube, Android. In fact, they just released their very first beta now. I'm waiting to get access. I haven't seen it yet, but new search, which is AI first search from Google. I guess the question to you, Jason, broadly speaking, is how should engineering teams weigh this sort of tool depth versus the breadth that you see? How do you decide which way to go? Similar to what we've seen in previous revolutions, I suspect, but I'm curious, is this one different?
Yeah, no, I think it's exactly the same. I think you've got, look over history, you've got, Microsoft, which, full stack, Windows, Exchange, Office, all the way down, everything is Microsoft ecosystem versus, kind of point solutions that are integrated, maybe more open source. You had, Apple versus Android, similar thing. Apple, complete vertically integrated stack, Android more open source and allow people to integrate and do more best of breed. That has always been, it's a very natural tension that goes, and as we have seen, both in the case of, let's say Apple and Google, with iPhone and Android, or Microsoft, in the Office ecosystem versus, the open source alternatives around, now, again, Google's a good example there, is companies can use either to their advantage, right? We've seen companies be very successful, all integrated around one. We've seen companies be very successful, using the more broad open source, best of breed kind of solutions. I typically prefer the latter, right? When we're working with companies, just because you can maintain some optionality and you can always, take pieces and integrate, new enhancements. However, I would say that's probably most companies tend to go buy, like, buy one. I'm going to buy everything from one. I'll just buy the whole Adobe ecosystem, the whole Salesforce, ecosystem. And they're fine. And they do fine with that too. They let the providers innovate for them and, are able to be successful that way. So either way can be successful. It's just, are you going to take on the innovations and the, integration, and how do we build this thing? You get a bunch of Legos. It's like, how do I build a Death Star? How do I go have to figure that out? But when I can customize and make however I want, versus I'll let someone have the pre-built one. I just snap the pieces together and off we go. I think companies that have always tended to do the, one of those will stay on that path. That's how they think about how doing things. So
that makes sense. And I think we're seeing an evolution of MCP, of course, coming out, A to A now being released from Google. So they're really embracing this interoperability between agents. Of course, that's the Google approach, to your point, that really interoperability, more open source model. Whereas OpenAI continues to be relatively closed. Their APIs are very limited. They don't release APIs very frequently. In fact, most of the tooling happens inside of their web browser, their application, months ahead of an API ever showing up. Do you think that this agent interoperability will actually take off, or is this just another standard war that we've seen before?
I don't know. I think that, interoperability standards are important, but not, by definition, not differentiating, right? And so, like, how important is SOAP or, REST, although that's not really a standard, but, some of these other interoperability standards, like, well, they're necessary, but not important.
Not sufficient to get you true differentiation in the marketplace.
Yeah, you still have to do something with them, right? Mm-hmm. So, once you have these things defined, well, it's easy to go get data from, let's say, weather.com, or it's easy to go get data from, Amazon or wherever. Well, that's great, but, nobody wants to go get data. That's not why you integrate with something. You want to do something with that data, use it to enhance your product, offer some, capability to user. That's the thing you need to focus on, like how it happens. Again, it's necessary and it's a great standard, and I hope people adopt it because it will make building things of real value on top of it really easy. But that's not, and so I would make sure that I focus on it, but it is a means to a better another end, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The agent to agent thing is interesting around, like, could there be autonomous kind of agent to agent interactions without any, either user or system level engagement? And that's a really interesting question to think through. I don't think we've seen enough of them in production to really know, but that to me could be something where there could be, some significant innovation, right? So take an example. You've purchased an airline ticket, another airline offers publishes a sale, something could recognize, oh, well, I could actually, change the flight. That's refundable. I could change this, get, you'd originally asked for these times. That's a better routing. And I can go through and make those changes and actually save money, for example, something like that. That is kind of a use case that is to me very compelling. But again, I think we'll have to see how some of those things get built. And the interesting thing about agents to me is, like, where do they run at a runtime, right? OpenAI wants to obviously have you run them there as the runtime, right? Of course, but are there other runtime options outside of the provider of the LLM? SnapLogic has a potential runtime for agents. I think somehow we do need to separate the runtime execution environment from the LLM environment.
Sure.
And I'm sure they are separated within OpenAI. Again, that goes back to the, are you vertically integrated all the way down, or do you have different pieces, you can swap in and out? But either way, logically separated, if not vendor separated. Logically separated allows for some of those things, but we'll have to see how the production implementations work out, I guess.
Given the huge investment from Microsoft and the integration with Azure and the rest of Office, I suspect that play may not be super separable, at least for the Microsoft stack, but I guess we'll see to your point.
On that, though, I mean, this is what's fascinating to me. Like, I think about this is where I feel like I don't know about the technology, don't know about the data, but I do think about the game theory. This is pretty fascinating. Think about, I mean, just where I was going to go the same path. Like, OpenAI is so dependent on Microsoft. So again, if you believe the rumors of rift between executives, I mean, we spent a previous pod talking about where NVIDIA fits in. And I think that what's intriguing to me right now is that things are going to go back to the pillars. And where are the pillars? Pillars are going to be AWS. The pillars are going to be Microsoft. The pillars are going to be Google. You have OpenAI. Musk is maybe or maybe not was trying to buy it for $100 billion, $97 billion not that long ago. And, whereas I would actually say you could almost probably make equal odds that someone would buy it for $100 billion, that it won't be around a year from now. I mean, think about that. I mean, for me, I think that's actually a realistically not a multi-standard deviation event. And I think it's partly because where is it going to fit? Why would I buy agents off of OpenAI when I can just power it onto Power Builder through Azure? So I mean, again, this is your guys' world, not mine in terms of the actual technology, but like, are there going to be agents talking? Absolutely. Why? Because that's the way that everything functionalities and features. We use the word agents today because they're replacing something that's being done. But what's the difference between an agent and a feature or functionality? And you start. So I think that where the world's going to continue to go is that you're going to have Jason, I think my response to where you're at, there's going to be something that's going to have to be, runtime, run state. I think that exists already within the cloud providers for the most part. I think it's going to be interesting that OpenAI, maybe Apple is actually the comparable to OpenAI, a relatively closed ecosystem, primarily consumer. Maybe that's ultimately where that market goes, where your enterprise buyers are going to be finding themselves in other tools. But this is what's kind of fun about right now. and it's huge dollars at play here on winners and losers in ways that we have not seen since probably early, really going back to a generation ago into early web technologies, where it's like you just didn't know who was going to win. I mean, when it came to cloud and mobile, it was kind of, we kind of already knew, but this is a case where, could you have a new emergent or a new ecosystem, or is it going to still be back to the standard oil, so to speak?
Well, I think you look at like OpenAI and you use that analogy as a consumer facing, and we can do, it can be the runtime. Yeah, for consumer facing stuff, that's what they want. Probably, Apple will have a similar thing as well. But for, companies looking to do things like, maybe that's appropriate for some employee use cases, like let me know if I have an email that I haven't responded to, or and so on the what I'll call the commodity end user compute side of the house, maybe some of those, there's enterprise versions of those consumer tools that you use, but like in actual big systems, right? The actual core functioning of the enterprise, whether that be their interactions with customers or other things, their core systems, I don't know that those are the right run times. And that's where I do think the cloud providers will offer that. I mean, we already see them offering, I think AWS has a new agent, runtime runner that can be developed and used by, application developers. And so as anything, we always have to split like the end user compute from the enterprise use, right?
I don't know. This is one of those moments where I can actually imagine those two getting a lot more conflated than you might suggest, which is at the end of the day, virtually every company deals with a consumer. So even if you're B2B, that other company has a consumer at the other end who's going to buy something from them ultimately. So what if there were a Cordera app called Strategic whatever, and you as a company just go directly buy that thing from the App Store? We're not even involved. We just wrote the app. We wrote the agent that now goes into your company and interrogates whatever. And interrogates, does the analysis.
Yeah.
So the entire process of B2B sales could look massively different, but we'll talk about it later because we have to continue on. If you think about sort of, I was at Uber at the days when Netflix had this big problem. They wanted to move to a different cloud. They wanted a discount from AWS. They couldn't. They were locked into that vendor for a variety of good reasons from an architectural design standpoint. The same thing is playing out with these AI services. Is this just another lock-in type moment when we have to be really careful, or is it really just so early it doesn't matter because everything's going to be shifted in 6 months anyway? Like how do you evaluate the risk of getting stuck with one vendor too deeply versus spending more money to integrate across all the vendors?
Yeah.
I think
don't do the latter is my answer to that.
Yeah, I mean that's where
you got to pick a horse and ride. Look, a lot of these, I want to have the same thing and I want it to run across Google and Azure, or AWS and Google, whatever. Like, just pick one and run it. That doesn't work. It never has. And I don't think that any of the AI stuff changes any of that.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, maybe a different way to come across the question, and really, Jason, your statement too, is that what would it take for another cloud provider to emerge? And, what would that look like? What would that, just even like theoretical, ask yourself that question. And, I guess for me, it'd be something that's going to be more couply tied to power. My guess is that cloud and power become very much aligned, and so how those play out may be a way to do that. But otherwise, right now, I think you are a little bit of like that is many ways. We talk about again in your book, and many others commonly say data is oil. It's possible cloud bandwidth is oil, and that's the real thing that chokes and what doesn't choke, and how that plays out. And then, so I think it's a really interesting question of like where the choke points are. NVIDIA may think, well, it's the chips. The cloud providers might think it's the pipes. Someone else might think it's the models. Well, I think goes back, the models are probably the easiest part. And so because you don't require physical infrastructure. We were, pre-recording, you guys were talking about, it's graduation season. Well, what do you recommend people to do? And, hey, a trade versus this versus tech. Well, at the end of the day, that last mile still requires, at this point, there's not an agent who's going to necessarily be able to do that. And so I think that right now puts pretty high onus on, on those different providers, and whether they want to lock. I mean, maybe with 2.5 providers there, depending on how you view Azure, maybe that's enough to have competitive advantage. We've seen that with Google and Apple, that they've kind of played that game for the last 20 years. But it's an interesting question. And then how do other providers emerge out of other spots around the world as well?
I think that's exactly right. And I think part of this, why would you not choose one? We're seeing Google's strategic advantage actually play out here at scale. So their current Gemini 2.5 is about 8 times cheaper than OpenAI's model. It's a significant, an order of magnitude difference in terms of cost per, again, depending if you're talking about inference time or input time, there's a little bit of difference there, but that's a huge delta. And to your point, I think that the long-term differentiation for country-level decisions and then potentially company-level decisions as well is going to be the actual power generation. And we know AI's appetite for power is insatiable, right? We know that the amount of increase in power is going to be 30, 40% just in the next few years. We're going to have to continue to grow that infrastructure significantly. I mean, that's doubling by 2030, so 5 years effectively. And yet, if you look at the projections for renewables, so again, if we go back just a slight generation ago, not even a full generation, just as part of generation, we saw the move towards EV being huge. A huge number of projects were then funded through tax credits and other things. And yet, 42 gigawatts of net new power that's going to be done by renewable. And yet we're seeing that 28% of those have come online, and that's it. And the rest have been canceled or at least delayed. And I think that this becomes a really interesting question of if power is the massive differentiator for the space, renewable being the fastest path to get there by and large, what's causing the slowdown? What's going on here? And it seems to be a confluence of factors, from supply chain issues to regulatory issues to changing tax credits back to that point when we opened. I guess question for you, Kevin, is broadly what do we do? What do companies do, especially with all these ESG movements they had and sort of initiatives they had started? What happens now?
Well, one, I think this is a topic for another discussion, but I think that the ESG is an interesting element, not to start. Well, I guess as I am starting there, but to me, it's fascinating how much that dominated press and then how fastly it's kind of gone away. I think the same thing. I don't know if ESG is synonymous with net zero, but I mean, I think it's really kind of interesting to see, when the realities start to set in, the need for power, the need for, just because I will something to exist doesn't mean that it will happen. I think that's when kind of practicality comes back. I think you're seeing that in energy policies today, and that's before we're really seeing the rampant growth. I mean, I think there's going to have to be, other technologies that emerge, whether it be older technologies that make a comeback and they more, in refined times. But I tend to, this is again my optimistic view of the world, is that energy consumption continues to increase. Every renewable, as it enters the grid, it just increases the overall consumption. I think that's before now we're seeing with AI and just really data center needs. We're going to have to increase other sources. It's going to have to come from different elements. Innovation begs innovation, and I think that'll be some of it. The hard part is where does the governments fit and where they don't? What's the public good? Most of our utilities are ultimately kind of controlled in that environment. So I think it's going to be, this is one where I don't have an answer. Besides, I think that your companies are going to have to spend a lot more time on this. Whereas ESG, maybe I do have an answer in this specific space. ESG was more around sustainability, and that was more around how you probably, some of it was political, some of it was conceptual, some of it was, some actually really good things around how you run more effectively. I think the power part of that is going to be increasingly important. Power is going to be increasingly really, that's a requirement for you to be able to run. That might be, you end up moving your operations to locations where there's more access to that, more stability in that. I think that, countries and states will probably be able to have a competitive advantage if they can work through that. I think it's, you're seeing lots of reasons why countries are shedding some of the policies, but just even what's going on in the U.S. here today around some of the EV policies of California, I think we're seeing a awakening that sometimes just because you wish something to be true doesn't mean that it can. What does that mean? How does it work through that? I do think that we need to be sustainable in our environment, and so it's not something we can just completely just go find a way to go get it. But I do think that human ingenuity will continue to refine, and I think that this is an area where it'll be fun to see what we create. It'll be fun to see what different things can occur that allows us to be able to really in this case, power this new frontier that's going to require energy that isn't going to work with the ways that we used to do it. And I don't know if it'll completely come from renewables.
Yeah, I think it's great. Jason, quickly over to you then as we wrap up here today. AI and energy collision course. Do companies need to do anything differently? Do they need to consider grid implications or constraints that might exist in their plan more broadly?
Well, I think this is largely a problem for the, big providers, right? And I think what you've seen is a lot of them focus on some, behind the meter solutions, right? Microsoft wants to build its own nuclear reactors in data centers to power them. And that may be what's necessary. You see people also trying to move to a lot of secondary locations, the flyover states for a lot of reasons, right? Land is cheap. Regulations are a little less restrictive around some of those, a little bit more, let's say, power friendly options there. And, I think they're going to have to innovate. I mean, it is a big problem, right? But again, unless you're in the business of running a data center or generating and distributing power, it's not your problem.
Yeah.
And so, especially as people have migrated largely to the cloud, and now, if people still, every company still had its own data centers, right? Then yeah, it's everybody's problem. But I think people, with most companies, 80+% having migrated to the cloud, it becomes the cloud provider's problem. And I think it is definitely a huge issue. I think they'll look to do it behind the meter.
Yeah, makes sense. I think, yeah, to your point, better planning is going to be required, no doubt. Interconnection queues are years long at this point. So even if you generate the power, which is already difficult from a permitting and just infrastructure and supply chain problem, like getting it hooked up to the grid is a whole different thing. I saw a really fascinating tweet over the weekend, or whatever you call them on X now, I don't know what you call them, where somebody's talking about the resiliency that's inherent in Starlink. So the entire city's power was down and their Starlink connection still works. They had a backup generator and they still had Starlink, which I thought was a really fascinating sort of resiliency play. So I think agility and resiliency, theme of the pod, but that'll be true here too, broadly speaking. So from crypto policy to AI to energy, these isolated, not so isolated stressors across organizations are changing everything. So as we wrap up today, this final thoughts from you guys. Again, crypto is integrating, it seems. Policy is destabilizing. AI is accelerating. Infrastructure is lagging. I think for executives, it's a challenging, wild time. We're just coming off of COVID. I feel like we just got to stability a little bit, and now we're right back to instability again. I think that proactive positioning is going to be paramount for all organizations strategically. With that in mind, any closing thoughts from you guys about what you see and what executives should be doing in this sort of rapid fire, whirlwind, changing environment and landscape?
I just continuing on the theme of I feel like there's a moment where I think the last 5 years, for the most part, we've been reactionary. COVID, response to COVID, all these different elements, and I think that you could make an argument that you're going to still be responsive today, but I think the teams that win, the teams that really grow, are the ones that say, no, this is a great time to be thinking about it, because I'd much rather think about what all these implications are to the future of my business than try to figure out how do I get a pizza from someone who can't talk to anyone or something like that, not to minimize the, those real problems that we saw 5 years ago. But I think that it's a lot more fun to be thinking about how do you react to grow and survive in the future versus where we've come from most recently.
That's great.
I think you just have to continue focusing on those foundational pieces, right? The ability to innovate and scale and quickly and have data and all those foundations. And back to the when's it's the best time to plant a tree, right? You cannot wait to focus on those.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think from my standpoint, it's an exciting time. This is the moment where you can truly differentiate your company and come out really far ahead. It's a question of how do you find the time to think strategically, give yourself that moment. And I think a little bit of a prediction here, I think people won't. And as a result, I think what you're going to see is a blow up of agentic models across the enterprise that weren't well designed, to your point. They didn't get the foundation right. They didn't think about this strategically. And so you're going to end up with some pretty massive data breaches effectively. I think that'll be a wake-up call for governance and infrastructure build out. But I would bet before this time in 26, we'll have at least one massive blow up of AI just going wild inside of a company and really causing real harm. Well, thank you guys for joining me. As always, for our listeners, are you leading through the chaos? Tell us how your organization is doing this. Visit us at the insights page at Credera.com. Thanks for listening.